Hey guys, my name is Chris, and today I want to show you how I updated this coffee table. The project was really fun, especially since the original table came from my wife's grandparents and the walnut for the top came from my grandparents. So it was pretty cool bringing parts from both sides of the family together into one project. But anyways, let's get started. So following what I mentioned before, this table has a lot of sentimental value, but it doesn't really match the rest of the things that we have. So the plan is to refinish the table, with the biggest change being a new top made out of walnut. But first things first, it's time to start taking it all apart. So with the top out of the way, I noticed that a corner of one of the back legs had a pretty big split in the wood. So I went ahead and loosened the screws holding that joint together, and I pulled that broken piece out. Then I threw in some glue and stuck the piece back in, and for good measure, I clamped it all down until the glue was dry. Next, I wanted to get the base ready to paint, which included sanding down the original finish that came with the table. I ended up having to sand a lot of it by hand to make sure I can get into all the little corners. Once I was done sanding, it was time to paint, and I was just using this off-white Valspar paint that I had left over from another project. And I always tell myself that I enjoy painting until I get to projects like these with lots of angles and corners and whatnot, which can make it pretty tedious. And I came back the next day and got started on the second coat. The base is starting to look a lot better, but there's still a ways to go. And later that day, I went ahead and put on a third coat. At this point, I needed a break from painting, so I went through the walnut boards that I had on hand, and I picked out the ones that I thought would look best for the tabletop. And after picking out the ones that I wanted to use, I swapped them around a few times until I found an overall pattern that I liked. Then I measured a rough 53 inches on each board, leaving some wiggle room and play before I cut the boards down to their final length. I went and grabbed the circular saw and I cut each piece down to the rough 53 inches that I just measured out. And now it was time to tackle the width of each piece. Most of these boards still had a live edge, so I moved over to my table saw to remove those edges and to try and get each piece as straight as I can. Alright, so I'm going to take a second to talk about this jig that we're using real quick. Because we want to join these boards together to make the tabletop, we want to make sure that the edges are perfectly straight so there's no visible gaps where the boards join. I unfortunately don't have a joiner yet, so I made this very simple jig to help me get straight edges using my table saw. So the jig itself has a straight edge for reference that will run along the fence, hopefully giving us a straight edge or a straight cut on this side. Then we'll take the board off, flip it over, run it through again, and ideally end up with two straight edges on all the boards. We'll see. With the boards about as straight as I can get them, I started making a few reference marks for my biscuit joiner. The biscuits aren't necessarily there to make the top any stronger. I'll be using them more to help me keep the boards lined up when I try gluing them together. Next, I set out a couple clamps and I laid the boards on their sides so I could start gluing them. I tried to make sure I put enough glue down so it would flow into each of the slots for the biscuits. So at the time of this project, I only had 4 large clamps, so I put 2 on the bottom and 2 on the top to help keep the top from cupping one way or another. I could have definitely used more clamps, but I made 4 work for this time around. While the glue was drying, I jumped back over to the base to put on a 4th and final coat of paint. But at this point, who's really counting anyways? When the glue was finally dry, the clamps came off and I used a chisel to scrape away all of the glue that squeezed out while the top was drying. And then I went in with a quick sanding to get the rest of the glue that I couldn't get with the chisel. And then I brought out a rag and applied some mineral spirits to help get rid of all the remaining sawdust. And this part's always pretty cool because it gives you a preview of what the wood's going to look like when it's finished. Now that the mineral spirits have dried up, it's time to start mixing the epoxy that I'll use to fill in all the holes and cracks. The product that I'm using requires equal parts A and B that I'll need to mix together. And then I'm also throwing in a drop of this black pigment to darken the epoxy, which should look really good with the walnut. Once it was all mixed together, I started filling in each of the cracks with the epoxy, and you can see that I'm using a plastic knife to do this. I figured that it would help me be a little more accurate on where I was putting the epoxy rather than just trying to pour it straight out of the cup. And then when I was done filling in everything with epoxy, I came back with my heat gun to pop all the bubbles that were rising to the surface. And once the epoxy was cured, it was time to sand it all down. And at this point, I figured I'd just start sanding the rest of the top to get it ready for the polyurethane. I started with around 150 grit sandpaper and worked my way up to 220. It was definitely lots and lots of sanding. After that, I brought over the base so I could start working on the final dimensions of the top. And after a few checks, I decided on leaving about a ½ inch or so of overhang around all of the edges. That left the width of the table about perfect as is, so I mainly had to trim down the length a little bit. Then I made a few final marks with the straight edge. I brought over the circular saw to make the final cuts. I went back and forth a couple times on how I wanted to finish the edges of this top, and whether I should leave a simple square edge or put a round over edge on it. Ultimately, my wife convinced me that a round over edge would work best for this table, so the router it was. Between the last couple cuts and bits of sanding that I've done, I came back with the mineral spirits one more time to get all of the remaining sawdust off. And with the top cleaned off, it was time for the polyurethane. And I'm just using the Minwax poly with a clear satin finish. I've seen this applied a few different ways, but I'm just applying the poly with a foam brush since I've had pretty good results with this method in the past. Then after the first coat of poly was dry, I came back and lightly sanded the surface with 220 grit sandpaper. This will help smooth out any bubbles or sawdust that would have dried in that first coat. After sanding, it was time for a second coat of poly, and you can really start to see the walnut come to life. And since this is a coffee table, it'll get a fair amount of abuse from drinks and plates and computers and whatnot. So I ended up putting 4 total coats of poly on, with light sanding between each coat. And once the final coat of poly was dry, it was time to get it all lined up and put back together. And finally, when it was all done, I was able to move it back to the living room and, of course, add the decorations that my wife put together. This is officially my second video, and I hope that you guys have enjoyed it. I have lots of other video ideas out there, so I hope to see you all around. And as always, thanks for watching.